Sorry?
Can leave you here.
Yeah.
Everything's set.
Yep. Thanks. Do I need to bring that up also?
Yeah, put everything in that bag except for this tripod.
Yeah.
Goes to the-
Okay. Yeah, I'll bring it back to the office.
See you later.
See you.
Really? What are you doing?
Because I have to take the APU to the class, so I sit here in class.
Well, I assume a lot of you sitting in all the classes.
Okay, so if you guys don't have a computer and hence didn't receive my email that I sent just before the recitation, then you can just pass this around. This is just some teched up version of what this recitation could be about. Okay. I should have recommended coming to the recitation, but I guess I didn't recommend it. I'm going to cover some basics that. Oh, you don't have a copy? Okay. So I'm going to cover basics that are going to be relevant through the entire course. They're going to be basics of vector algebra. So we're going to discuss at least what are vector spaces, what are normed spaces, what are inner product spaces, things like that, just to give you the feel of things that we might see. It's not absolutely necessary that you know all of this, but if you don't, then you should look up Wikipedia and just read it up. Just some basics of linear algebra that we'll be using and seeing through the course, and some probability and calculus basics. So let me just get started with things that you should. So I'm going to just go fast through the first part of the recitation and just outline the kinds of things that you should know. And if you don't know them, then you should just go back and read them. And the second part, I'll actually discuss a different way of looking at the simplex algorithm, which I find extremely intuitive and simple compared to the Tableau method that is usually taught. And so I'm going to try and go through that. And I will spend most of the recitation on that. So first, like vector spaces. Broadly, people should be familiar with what a vector space is. It's a collection of elements which is basically, you can say, closed under addition. You can think of them as vectors in Rn if you want to. But they're closed under addition, they're closed under scalar multiplication. So if you multiply a vector by 5 times that vector, it's still in the space. You should be familiar with what a subspace is. So a subspace of a vector space is just a subset of all those vectors which also obey the same set of properties. So if you want to think of three-dimensional space as being one vector space, then R2, which is two-dimensional space, is a subspace of R3. So, but it's still, R2 is also closed under addition and scalar multiplication and so on. So you should just be familiar with what a subspace is and what a vector space is. But this is quite a usual definition. You should be familiar with what a metric space is. So presently, when you start off with a vector space, all it needs to be is a collection of vectors which are closed under addition and like scalar multiplication and things like that. Right now, we have no notion of distance between points. When you define a vector space, you need not have any definition of distance between points, and that's what a metric space is. So a metric space is basically like, it's a vector space with some kind of notion of distance between 2 points x and y. And so this function D must satisfy some basic properties, like it should always be non-negative, and it should obey the triangle inequality, like distance between x and z is related to is smaller than the distance between x and y plus the distance between y and z. So the triangle inequality. There are some additional constraints on what a valid distance metric is. For example, distance between x and x has to always be equal to 0. And sometimes it's also required to be the other way around. That is, if the distance between x and y is 0, then you should be able to say that x is equal to y. But you can drop that constraint also. So you can drop the reverse constraint. That is, it is possible for the distance to be 0 without the two elements actually being equal. In that case, we might call it a semi-metric or a pseudo-metric, and there are some other variations of metrics. There's often a symmetry requirement on D, that is D of xy is equal to D of yx. Again, often that is also dropped. You need not have that, and in that case it's not called a metric, it might be called like a pseudo-metric or something like that. An example of that would be the KL divergence, if you've seen it, where the KL divergence of P and Q is not the same as KL between Q and P, but it is always positive and it does obey triangle equality, things like that. So that's a metric space. So now we have, from vector spaces, we have now added a metric which gives some notion of distance between them. So this is one level up. You then can have what's called a normed space, which is a little more complex. So what this does is, it, for every point in the space, it defines a notion of a norm for that point, okay? And this norm automatically defines a metric, and the metric in that case would be like the norm between the 2 points x and y. Okay, so a norm is any function that satisfies like what you know about intuitively about the 2 norm or anything like that, that it always has to be positive, it obeys the triangle inequality, if it's equal to 0, then the point has to be 0, and so on. So a norm satisfies these basic properties. And if I start off with a normed space, then it automatically defines a metric on that space. And lastly, we have like we have an inner product space. So an inner product space basically defines what's called an inner product between any two points in the space. And again, if we start off with an inner product space, then we can define a norm, which is the square root of the inner product of a point with itself. And if we have a norm, then we can define a metric and on top of vector space. So in some sense, a vector space is the most simple object. A metric space is has little more structure. It has a distance metric between points, but it need not have a norm or an inner product. And normed space is one more step of complication, where it has a norm which induces a metric, but need not have an inner product. And the most complex is like an inner product space, where there are inner products which induce norms, which induce metrics in the space. Okay, so this is just stuff that you should kind of be familiar with, the properties of an inner product, that it's linear, like x. Like if I multiply any scalar to any of these, then the scalar can just come out of the inner product linearly scaled. If I have the dot product for x and y plus z, then it's the dot product of x and y plus the dot product of x and z. So these are just basic properties of the inner product. So you should be familiar with properties of inner products, properties of norms, properties of distance of metrics, and things like that. So I mean, it's going to come up in subtle ways through the course. If you're not familiar with it, it's just good to read up this stuff. Then we have I guess linear algebra basics. Okay, so if you guys have this in front of you, you should know what positive definite matrices are. Okay, so positive definiteness. So that's actually defined in several ways. So you should just be familiar with the different ways in which we define positive definiteness of a matrix. But if I have a matrix A, then it's said to be positive definite if x transpose AX is greater than or equal to 0 for all x. Right? So this is what it means for a matrix to be positive definite. Now, if I give you a positive definite A, you can actually induce a different kind of norm on the space. So everyone's used to seeing the Euclidean norm. The Euclidean norm is like the 2 norms squared is just x1 squared plus x2 squared plus x3 squared for any vector. But there's no need that, when we're working in Euclidean space, that we have to stick to the Euclidean norm. We could also have a positive definite matrix A that induces a norm. So if I ask you what's the norm of a point x, it's going to be x transpose AX. When A is the identity, then it's just the 2 norm. but A could be any other positive definite matrix, and that's inducing a different norm on the space. I mean, it'll be just useful to know the properties of positive definite matrices, because they'll come up with the Newton's method and the Hessian, which is the positive definite matrix. They'll come up in semi-definite programming later in the course. So it'll just be useful to know what are the different properties of A. For example, you can always write A as U transpose U for two other matrices U. This is also known as a Cholesky decomposition of A. So it's good to know that you can actually write A as the inner product between 2 points. So this is also called the Gram matrix. So every positive definite matrix is actually like a Gram matrix for some set of vectors. So there are multiple interpretations of what a positive definite matrix is, and it's just good to get a handle of all of them. Then there are matrix dot products. So if I have two matrices A and B, then you should start to get familiar with what a matrix dot product is. And again, you could define several there are actually several ways to define dot products between vectors. Similarly, there are many ways to define dot products between matrices, but the standard Euclidean dot product for matrices is where you just string them out as vectors and write them. So it's another way to write it is trace of, maybe it's A transpose B, or another way is just sum over all I and j of Aij, Bij. So if you just strung them out as vectors and took the dot product, that's the traditional dot product for these matrices. Now, again, once I've defined an inner product on matrices, that immediately gives me a norm on matrices, and that's called the Frobenius norm. And the Frobenius norm is basically the square root of the dot product of the matrix with itself. Okay, and another way to write this is the sum of squares of all entries. So it's like the two norms of a matrix, right? So that's the Frobenius norm of a matrix. So it's good to just know these kind of things. And there are some other norms which are useful as well for matrices. One of them is the spectral norm.
Square root BC.
Sorry?
Square root.
Oh yeah, this is the square root. Right. I'm assuming that for vectors, people are familiar with the one norm of a vector, which is just the sum of the absolute values of the vector. You should be familiar with the infinity norm of a vector, which is the maximum absolute value element of that vector. Now, in a very similar spirit to the one norm and the infinity norm, we define the spectral norm and the nuclear norm for matrices. So the nuclear norm of a matrix A, which is often written with a star, is this is the sum of all the entries, this is the sum of all the singular values. So if you wrote down the SVD of a matrix A and you summed the diagonal elements of the singular values matrix, then that's it. So this is the sum of the singular values. Maybe I should call it sigma. So that's the usual notation. Okay, so I'm just going to add up all the singular values. And similarly, like the infinity norm is the largest element, the spectral norm is spectral is often written in other ways. It's written with a 2 sometimes and stuff too. So it's just the maximum. It's the largest. It's the largest singular value. Just get familiar with all these things.
Are those norms if the matrix is not positive?
Well, yeah, these norms always hold. Yeah, I mean, the singular values are always positive. Okay. Right. So then you should also know like what the SVD of a matrix is. Everyone should be familiar with that. The eigenvalue decomposition of a matrix. PCA, principal components. Yep.
For the definition of positive definite, should it be strictly determined?
So positive definite is greater than 0 and positive semi-definite is greater than equal to 0. So it's just a, maybe I should write this as PSD because that's normally how it's written. You guys should be familiar with the column space of a matrix. So that's just the span of all the column vectors of a matrix. Similarly, the row space of a matrix is the span of all the rows of the matrix. The null space of a matrix is just the set of all vectors such that AX is equal to 0. So you should just be familiar with all these definitions. And similarly, the column rank, which is equal to the row rank, which is which is the dimension minus the null space rank. Then there are under and over constrained linear systems. Both of these you should sort of be familiar with. A linear system is where we try to solve AX equal to B. So that's a linear system. If it's over constrained, so suppose X is in Rn. Okay, so if it's over constrained, it means that there are more constraints than variables. So A can be thought of as a tall, thin matrix. There are more constraints than variables. If this is under constraint, then you should think of X as being high dimensional and A as being short and fat. So there, this is over constrained and this is under constrained. You should just be familiar with this because this is the most common applications of least squares regression, lasso, things like that. So normally you'll, whenever it's under constraint, you'll apply lasso or ridge regression. If it's over constrained, you're trying to find the least square solution. Again, you might apply a ridge regression here, but probably not a lasso. So, but just kind of be familiar with what an under constraint system is, what an over constraint system is, what to mean by those terms at least. They'll come up in the course. Lastly, with probability and calculus, I guess everyone should be familiar with gradients. So yeah, especially with functions of vectors, right? So if you have f of x, where x is a vector, then you should know how to take gradients of such functions and take second derivatives of such functions, which are Hessians, which are matrices. I mean, I'm not going to go through that, but you should, if you're not familiar with higher dimensional calculus, then just read up on Wikipedia about it. It's, so the gradient of this function is going to be a vector. Second gradient is the Hessian. Should be familiar with Jacobians. So the Jacobian is just if it's a function from Rn to Rm. So normal functions are from Rn to R, but if you have a function from Rn to Rm, then the gradient itself of that function is going to be a matrix, and that's called the Jacobian. So just be familiar with those. You're going to come up with a lot of gradients and Hessians in this course, so you should just be familiar with that. And there's Taylor's theorem, which is basically all of statistics, and it's also lots of optimization, which basically states that you can always write a function. You can expand it in terms of like a first point, a linear term with a gradient, a second order term with a Hessian, and more terms if needed. And so that's often that's going to be very useful through the course. So it'd be good to brush up on your Taylor's theorem skills. Then you should know how to take what expectations are and how to take expectations, especially iterated expectations, where you're taking expectations over multiple variables and you condition on some of them. So expectations with respect to x and y is often expectations with respect to x given y, and then an expectation with respect to y. So you should know what the law of iterated expectations are. Again, it's here in this. So if there's some terms that you are not familiar with, just Wikipedia it and you get a good idea. One important thing that everyone should know is convergence. So this is going to come up repeatedly in the course, especially in the theoretical aspects of the course, and so everyone should be familiar with what it means for a sequence to converge. And so a sequence, I mean I guess you should know it intuitively more than formally. So formally, if I have a sequence x1, x2, x3 to xn, such a sequence converges to x if for every epsilon greater than 0 there exists an n after which xn minus x is less than epsilon in absolute value. That's a formal definition of convergence, but intuitively it just means that you should get closer and closer to the value that you're saying you're converging to. So you'll often see something like, we say that it has a convergence rate of 1 by capital T, and that just it can, or something like the error goes to 0 at a rate of 1 by t. All that means is that as t goes to infinity, the sequence of errors is going to look like 1 by 3, 1 by 4, 1 by 5, 1 by 6, and so on, and it's going to converge to 0 at that rate. So you should just have a feel of what 1 by t convergence is, 1 by square root of t. You'll see a lot of these kind of terms floating around through the course. So just get a feel of convergence and what you mean by a rate of convergence. Okay, so that's it for the primer for the course. Does anyone have any questions at this point? No. Okay. So let me then tell you about this alternate view of the simplex algorithm, which I think is very, very intuitive. Let's just set up the problem. I'm going to set it up slightly differently from what we did in class, but the number of steps involved to really understand what's going on in the simplex is very small. So the setup here is going to be where we maximize C transpose X, and we're going to be subject to AX less than equal to B. Okay. So in class we actually learned how to convert this into standard form, where AX was equal to B with X greater than equal to 0, things like that. But I'm going to talk about just what if you had a program like this. What is an intuitive way in which one would go about solving this? So the first thing to note, just to get some intuition of what this set is like, how this set behaves, and how an optimum over the set behaves, it's useful to think about starting off with a set which is not a linear set, which is not described like this, but a set which is like X transpose X less than equal to 1. Okay, so this is just a circle. Okay, so I have a unit circle, and I'm asking you to maximize C transpose X over the unit circle. Okay, so I have a unit circle, and I ask you to maximize C transpose X over the circle. Now, I think it's it should be pretty obvious to you that the maximum this can get is when X is parallel to C. So basically, like C transpose C is really the maximum you're going to get, and the minimum you're going to get is like C transpose minus C. I mean, except that this has to be a unit vector, so the maximum is going to be achieved basically when I go in the direction of C as much as I can till I hit that point, which is going to be C by norm of C, and the minimum is going to be in the opposite direction till I hit that point, which is minus C by norm of C. Okay, that should be fairly obvious that you can't do anything better than that. So what we did over here was basically we followed the cost vector and pushed it against the boundary of the set, and that was going to be what maximized it. Right? Now, if you were not in such a set, which is a circle, but instead you were in some kind of polygon, the intuition still remains the same. What you really want to do is you want to just go in the direction of C as far as you can in the set. That's basically all the intuition is that if I had any other set, then just go in the direction of C till you can go and then stop, right? So it should be clear that the optimum of a linear program is achieved at a corner, and that's because if I keep pushing till I can't push anymore, I'm going to hit a corner eventually. I might hit a side, but that's a special case. But in general, I'm going to, if I just go in the direction of C as much as I can in a set, I'll eventually hit a corner. So it should be intuitively clear to you, at least from in 2 dimensions, that if I'm maximizing a linear function over a polygon, then it's going to be maximized at a corner. So what that tells us is that we only need to search over corners. Okay, so searching over corners is enough. I don't need to search in the interior. I don't need to search on any of the faces or sides or lines. I can just search among all the corners, and I know that one of the corners is going to maximize it.
So the polygon where it's square, then not so obvious as to why it should be a corner. You could have an arbitrary cost vector which will intersect the side.
Yeah, but then you can actually push even further. Like you should convince yourself that, like, if you had something like this, all you need to go is in this direction. Like, I mean, if you went in this direction and you hit here, that's actually not the most you can go. What you need is to consider this hyperplane, which is, and then push that hyperplane as much as you can in this direction until you reach there. And so it's actually that point which is the furthest point that you can go in direction C. I mean, like this way doesn't matter for the cost. Going perpendicular to C doesn't matter, it doesn't change your cost at all. So, but going parallel to C, you want to push it as much as you can and it's going to be there. So if you thought that it's going to intersect some point here, no, I mean, I can still go further that way.
The only other case is if you're actually perpendicular to an edge, and then you're gonna, then all the points on the edge will have the same cost, but so will the corner, so you might as well choose that.
So that's a special case of this. So what is basically, the intuition you should get should carry forward to higher dimensions as well. So if you have some kind of a higher dimensional closed and bounded polyhedron, right? So something that just, that's what AX less than equal to B is. It's just a bunch of hyperplanes just intersecting each other. And you have this cost vector, and what you really want to do is push that cost vector as much as you can inside that hyperplane. It's going to be maximized at the corner. Now it's hard to do this in general, to just push it till you're inside. So what we're going to do instead is start off at some corner and then just keep jumping corners. Okay, so we're going to start off at one corner and jump. And I'm going to show you that that's really simple to do from a linear algebra perspective. It's really easy to jump corners. So for now, I'm going to assume certain things that are just on AX less than equal to B. I'm just going to make some assumptions that are going to help us make things a little simpler. One is that there are no degeneracies in this. What I mean by degeneracies is that suppose this is an n-dimensional space, right? So X is in Rn, right? So you need n hyperplanes to intersect to get a point, right? Whenever two lines intersect in 2D, you get a point. Whenever three planes intersect in 3D, you get a point, and so on. So you need n hyperplanes to intersect to get a point. It's not degenerate, just means that there's no point through which n plus 1 hyperplanes are all passing through, right? So they all, every intersection of n hyperplanes here passes through a different point. So it's not like n plus 1 of them are all passing through the same point. That's what you mean by that. So that's degeneracy. I'm also going to assume that, so what that also gives us is that that doesn't give us immediately, but we're going to assume that this body is full dimensional. Like if we're in 3D, then it actually has volume. That is, it's not a square in 3D, it's not a line in 3D or something like that. It's actually a 3D body which has 3-dimensional volume. So we're going to assume that this body actually has n-dimensional volume. That is, it's not a subspace of n dimensions or something like that. It's full rank in some sense. This body is full rank. So those are just like, I mean, those are like subtle cases that you'll have to handle maybe more specially. But in general, given anything like this, yeah, it's going to be full rank. You're not going to have specially constructed examples where n plus 1 hyperplanes pass through the same point. Okay. Right. So just now assume that we start off from some given vertex. Okay. So we're given some x naught such that ax naught is less than equal to b. Okay. It should convince you that there are ways in which you could find this x naught, which is like you could take a subset of the equations and solve them to get equality. But what do I mean by I'm at one vertex such that ax naught is equal to b? A vertex is basically a point where a prime x naught is equal to b prime for some n cross n matrix a prime. So I would have n of these equations which are equality, and all the other equations are they're inequalities. So maybe I should call this b prime and b double prime. So this is what it means to be I'm at a vertex. So if I'm at one vertex, it basically means that n of those hyperplanes are intersecting at that vertex, so they're equality, and all the other hyperplanes are feasible. So I'm at a feasible vertex of this polyhedron. So I'm just assuming I'm starting off at one vertex, and I'm going to show you how to jump vertices and keep increasing the cost. Okay. So the first thing to understand now is if I ask you how many neighbors does this vertex have? Okay, so I'm in some polyhedron in n-dimensional space. Okay, with points intersecting. I'm at a point where n different hyperplanes intersect, and I ask you how many neighboring vertices does this point have? Does anyone have an answer? Anyone have a clue? Yeah, okay. Unfortunately, some people have already read it, but yeah. It has n neighbors. Can you give me an intuition of why it has n neighbors? So I'm claiming that any vertex, including this vertex that I start off at, has exactly n other vertices that are neighbors of it in this closed and bounded polyhedron given by that. Do you have any idea why it has n neighbors?
Every minus one functions defines a line, so there are actually n minus that was this one.
That's perfect. Okay, so I'm going to repeat what he said. So what he said was basically these n hyperplanes intersect at a point, but when n minus 1 hyperplanes intersect, they actually intersect in a line. Okay, so n minus 1 hyperplanes intersect in a line. So whenever I throw out any one of these equations, I throw out one of them. The other n minus 1 of them are intersecting to form a line, and that line leads to a new vertex. So basically I can drop the first equation and the other n minus 1 are forming one line. I can drop the second equation and the other n minus 1 of them are forming another line, and so on. So basically it has n neighbors because there are n lines that are heading out of this vertex. Okay, so right, so I have x naught and I have n different lines that are heading out of x naught. Does everyone agree? Okay, that's good. So now we have a vertex. We know that there are n lines heading out of it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to explicitly calculate what are those directions. What are the directions of the n lines? Okay, so what vectors do they point at, right? So let's assume that its neighbors are x1 to xn. Okay, so I have neighbors. So its neighbors are x1 to xn. So the directions to its neighbors are basically x1 minus x0, x2 minus x0, and so on till xn minus x0. So this is the directions of those lines. Okay. So what do I know about these directions? What I'm going to do is I'm going to calculate a prime times x1 minus x0. Okay. So a prime was this matrix. So I know that a prime x0 is equal to b prime. So what do I know about a prime x1 minus x0? So I told you that x1 as a neighbor means that n minus 1 of these equations are still satisfied, and one of those equations became an inequality. Okay, so it became an inequality such that it was equal to b prime, but it became less than b prime. So for this guy over here, I know that a prime x1, n minus 1 of those equations, there's equality. And this one also has the same n minus 1 equations as equality. So a prime x naught is equal to b prime entirely. And a prime x1, n minus 1 of those rows are equality, but one row is an inequality. So what I know is that this vector is actually going to look like, it's going to be a negative value and zeros everywhere else. Does everyone agree with me? That if I look at the direction to the first neighbor, then the direction satisfies a prime times x1 minus x0 is basically negative and all zeros. Because that was the definition of x1, that it satisfied n minus 1 of the equations that x0 satisfied, and one of them became an inequality. You can write down a similar thing for all of them. So if a prime x2 minus x0 is going to basically be 0, a negative value, and zeros. So what that means is that these directions, I'm going to call them Z. Okay, so these directions, they actually satisfy A prime Z is equal to minus the identity. So why am I writing the identity? Even though I told you it's some negative value, but the point is I'm only looking for a direction. I don't really care about whether I scale it up or down. So I can always assume that this is minus 1, and this will just be some rescaled value of the direction. So what I know is that my directions, my n directions are such that A prime times those directions are actually going to be minus the identity matrix. And basically what that means is that the directions to my neighbors are just minus A prime inverse, which is pretty cool. So that's it. I have a closed form for what my neighbors are. So I'm at one point at which I have an equality holding. I ask what are my neighbors? It's just minus A prime inverse. Those are the directions to all my neighbors. Okay? Is everyone satisfied with why these are the directions? Okay. Good. So now I know the directions to all my neighbors. So what am I going to do? I'm going to do the most trivial thing. I have n neighbors, and I know the directions to them. I'm just going to find out in which direction I actually increase in value. So I'm trying to maximize C transpose X. I'm at a point X naught, so my value is C transpose X naught. So I'm just going to ask in which of these n directions does my value increase. Okay, so I'm going to just take any one point. So I'm just going to take any I such that C transpose Zi is greater than 0. So in other words, what I'm trying to do is just find any direction to any neighbor in which I'm actually going to increase value. So why do I claim that this is going to increase value? Because if the neighbor is in direction given by the columns of this matrix, so the columns of this matrix are the directions to my n neighbors, then any neighbor will basically be given by x naught plus lambda times Zi, right? So if I maybe lambda I times Zi and so on. So all the neighbors can be written as like this form. So the first neighbor is start from x naught, move in direction z1 for some amount lambda 1. It's going to be some amount in direction 1. And the second neighbor is going to be start at x naught, go in direction z2 for some amount lambda 2. But the point is that all of them are going to have this form. And so if I ask you what is the value at those neighbors, it's going to be given by C transpose x naught plus lambda I times C transpose Zi. So it's going to be the value at my original vertex plus some quantity C transpose Zi. So as long as I choose any of my neighbors such that C transpose Zi is greater than 0, then I know when I head in that direction, I'm going to increase value. Okay, so I'm just going to choose any neighbor out of these guys. I have Z1 to Zn, and I'm just going to calculate any guy such that the value is larger than where I am right now. So let's just assume that we found one guy. So if we did not find any guy, so suppose all my neighbors were such that C transpose Zi is less than 0, then I'm going to argue that we are already at the maximum. We are already at the global, we're at a local maximum and a global maximum. But assume for now that there is such a point such that C transpose Zi is greater than 0. There is such a direction. And what I want to do is go in that direction Zi till I actually hit a vertex. So I have not told you how much to move in that direction. So I haven't told you how much lambda I is. But I've told you that that's the direction to the neighbor. So let's just actually find out how much we can step in that direction. So you should note that the only thing that limits us when we are walking in direction Zi, so we start at x naught, we are walking in direction Zi, the only thing that stops us from walking is that these inequalities get violated. Okay, so we are really just searching for a point. We are searching we're searching for a lambda such that C transpose, such that A times x naught plus lambda Zi is actually still less than equal to B. Okay, so we want to walk as far as we can in direction lambda, because the farther we walk in direction lambda, the more we are increasing the cost. So we want to keep walking, and at some point we won't be able to walk any further because we will violate some condition. So the point at which the maximum value of lambda that we could possibly walk is just given by crossing over sides. It's just given by so I'm just going to change sides over here. I'm just going to solve for lambda. It's going to look like B minus AX naught divided by AZI. So it's just going to look like that. And this just implies that lambda is, and it has to be the smallest such value. So it's the smallest such J such that B minus AJ x naught divided by AJ Zi. This is just, I mean, these are different equations. So I mean, each one of those equations has to be true. And the smallest such value of lambda that makes sure that all those equations remain true is this value of lambda, the smallest such value, right? And that's it. That's basically the simplex algorithm. What did I do? I started off at x naught. I solved for all its neighbors. I chose a neighbor which is going to increase that value. I choose a step size which will lead me to that neighbor. I'm now at a new vertex. What do I do at the new vertex? That is repeat the process. At this new vertex, a different set of n of those hyperplanes are going to be equalities, and you can come in if you want. So yeah, so as I was saying, at the new vertex, n minus one of those equalities are going to be the same. One of those inequalities was swapped out and a different one was swapped in. And again, I can calculate its neighbors by taking all the ones that have equality and calculating the inverse. And just choose a different point now such that it increases the value. And just keep repeating this process. That's a simplex algorithm. So it starts off at vertex and keeps jumping vertices as long as it can increase that value, C transpose. What do you call it? The optimal value. You get what I mean. Okay, any questions?
I'm not quite sure why the function here A prime C equals minus the identity matrix. So why should it be identity?
So the point is that we are trying to solve for some set of directions. What do I know about the set of directions? I know that, so do you agree with this point?
Yeah.
Okay, so you know that A prime type x1 minus x0 is negative.
Yeah.
So you're trying to find this vector x1 minus x0. This is what you're trying to find, right?
Okay.
Now, if I give you x1 minus x0, or if I give you 2 times x1 minus x0, or if I give you x1 minus x0 by 2, I mean the direction still remains the same, right? If I change the scale, if I multiply this by a scalar, that doesn't change the direction of the vector, right? So if I want to solve for this, I might as well solve for this as being minus 1, right? I mean, I will only solve for like something that's parallel to this vector but scaled by a constant, right? So all I'm saying is that you can consider this to be minus 1 and solve for z's.
So we will find out the global optimal will be a global.
So, okay, so that's, maybe I can try and convince you that the local optimum is the global optimum. So this is true for all convex optimization problems. It's also true for linear optimization problems that a local optimum is a global optimum.
But we are only searching the corner, so it's not like the full space.
Right, but that's what I was trying to convince you in the first part, that when you're doing a linear optimization problem, the optimum always lies at a corner. So you only need to search the corners. You know that one of those corners is the optimum.
And how do we choose the initial point at the x3?
That's the only subtlety. I mean, you could just take any subset of the equations and solve them, and just verify that it's a feasible point by checking the other inequality.
So just go ahead and take
Sorry?
So just go ahead and pick some constraints and stuff.
Yeah, I mean it's the usual problem with the simplex is how do you find a point? How do you find any vertex? Yeah, you just take some subset of inequalities and solve them, and just check that it's feasible. Yeah. But given a point, it should be very easy to step to other points.
And the A matrix is not so rough.
So I mean, usually this is never a problem because what's the best way to say this? So in the worst case, the simplex algorithm is exponential time. Okay, so in the worst case, I can construct an example for you such that you will take an exponential number of steps to find the optimum. But the simplex algorithm is known to be smooth polynomial time. What that means is that if I randomly perturb my instances, so if I start off with A, but I add an arbitrarily small perturbation to A, so that is, if I'm searching in a particular polytope, I just perturb all the A's a little bit, so I'm pretty much searching in the same polytope, except it's slightly perturbed. Then I can prove to you that the expectation over this perturbation of the time that you will take to solve the simplex algorithm is actually polynomial time. And that's a very strong statement. It's saying that, sure, you can pinpoint a worst case which takes exponential time, but any random perturbation, any tiny random perturbation of that is going to be polynomial time. So the simplex is known to be smooth polynomial time. And in general, when we talk about such algorithms, you don't really, if you're really concerned that n plus 1 hyperplanes will pass through the same point, then you can slightly randomly perturb your instance and expect to get pretty much the same optimum and also in polynomial time. So, I mean, of course, I'm just hiding what the nature of the perturbation is. It has to be a particular Gaussian perturbation of some small variance, things like that. But it's fairly well studied as to how to perturb linear programs to kind of be confident that it's going to be polynomial time if you're using simplex. There are other algorithms for LPs which are known to be polynomial time in the worst case, like the ellipsoid algorithm is worst case polynomial time, but simplex is known to be worst case exponential time. But they found that in practice the simplex always performed amazingly, always performed in polynomial time in some sense. And the reason for that is any real life instance should be considered as an instance in which you just have noisy measurements for all your cost vectors, for how much for transportation costs, times, anything like that. They're all going to be slightly noisy, and so you're never going to get really a worst case instance. You'll get worst case instance plus some small random noise, in which case the simplex algorithm is it's called smooth polynomial time. So you don't really come across those cases, but if you do, you can slightly perturb it. Any other questions? Okay, so I mean that's all I had for now. I think that while this might help with your intuition for the simplex algorithm, it's good to know the Tableau method because I think that that's what might be tested, it's I think Danzig's original method or whatever. So you should know the Tableau method that was taught in class. But I personally find this much easier to remember and intuitively start with corner, find vertex, something like that. So hopefully it will help you if you ever need it in the future. Anyway, thank you.